that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. During my second year studying environmental sciences at Utrecht University, I took a part-time job working the late shift at a roadside restaurant about 12 kilometers outside the city, along one of those flat provincial roads that cut straight through the Dutch polder landscape like a ruler drawn across a map. I was 19, perpetually short of money, and possessed of the particular brand of student optimism that makes bad decisions feel like reasonable ones. My parents lived in a small village called Zwanenburg, roughly 8 kilometers from the restaurant along a network of narrow dike roads that ran between the fields and the water channels. On weeknights, I caught the early bus. On weekends, when the last bus ran at 11 and the shift ended at midnight, I walked. I want to be clear about what those roads are like at that hour. The polder is flat in every direction for as far as you can see, which means that in daylight it feels expansive and open, and at night it becomes something entirely different. There is nowhere to go. No hills, no buildings set back from the road, no meaningful cover of any kind beyond the reeds along the water channels and the occasional stand of willows. The roads themselves are barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass each other. Streetlights are positioned perhaps every 400 meters and give just enough light to confirm the darkness between them. I had walked that route perhaps 30 or 40 times without incident and had come to think of it as unremarkable. I understand now that this was a form of complacency, and that complacency on empty roads at night is a specific kind of carelessness. The night I'm describing was a Saturday in late September. The restaurant had been running at capacity since noon because there was a cycling event passing through the region, and the car parks had been full since morning. By the time we closed and cleaned down the kitchen, it was approaching 12:30, and I left the building with the best tips I'd accumulated since starting the job. A little over 90 euros folded into my jacket pocket, which felt like a genuine fortune at 19. My colleague Finn had offered me a lift to the edge of the village, but he was going in the opposite direction, and I told him not to bother. The walk was 45 minutes on a route I knew well. The night was cold and clear. I had a podcast running in my earphones, and I was in genuinely good spirits. For the first 20 minutes, the walk was exactly as it always was. Flat road, black fields on both sides, the distant silhouette of a grain elevator against the sky to the south, the occasional blink of red light from a wind turbine on the horizon. I was roughly halfway home, crossing the section of road that runs alongside the widest water channel, when I became aware of headlights coming from behind me. The car slowed as it reached me, not to a stop, but to the kind of deliberate crawl that makes you aware of being observed. It went past me at a speed that let whoever was inside take a full look. I pulled one earphone out and glanced toward the car as it moved ahead. A dark-colored estate car, nothing distinctive. I assumed the driver had slowed because the road was narrow and they wanted to be sure of their line, or possibly because they were looking at house numbers, though there weren't any houses on that stretch. The car pulled about 150 meters ahead of me and stopped. I kept walking. I assumed it would start again. It didn't. It sat in the middle of the road with its rear lights on and its engine running, and as I continued toward it, I began running through explanations, a phone call, a dropped item, a driver consulting a map. All reasonable, all possible, but there was something about the quality of that stillness, the deliberateness of where it had stopped in relation to where I was, that produced a feeling in my chest that I did not immediately have a name for. Not fear exactly, a heightened attentiveness, the way your body sometimes registers something as significant before your conscious mind is caught up. Then the engine revved once, and the car drove away. I stood on the road for a moment watching its tail lights shrink and disappear around a long bend, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. I put my earphone back in and kept walking. I was perhaps 2 minutes further along the road when I saw headlights again, this time coming toward me from the opposite direction. I moved slightly to the right to give the car room on the narrow road and kept my eyes forward, and as it passed me I registered, in the half second I had a look at it, that it was the same dark estate car. The same shape, the same profile. It had driven ahead, turned around somewhere out of sight, and come back. It stopped again about 150 meters ahead, same distance as before, facing me this time. I stopped walking. My heart was doing something I could feel. I stood at the edge of the road, looking at the car's headlights, and trying to maintain the part of my brain that was still looking for innocent explanations. Maybe they were genuinely lost and were too shy to approach on foot and were waiting for me to come to them. Maybe there were two similar dark estate cars out here, and I was connecting them incorrectly. Maybe I was exhausted and slightly cold, and my pattern recognition was manufacturing threats out of coincidence. Then the headlights went off. Not both at once, which is what happens when you switch off the ignition, one after the other, like someone reaching for a switch deliberately. And then the car began to move toward me. Slowly, lights off, engine barely audible at first, and then gradually louder, creeping down the middle of the road in the dark. I'm not a person who panics easily, and I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment, because I think it's important. Every rational process stopped. I was not thinking about what the most likely explanation was. I was not running probability assessments. What I experienced was pure and immediate physical terror of the kind I had never felt before and have not felt since, the kind that belongs to a much older version of the human nervous system than the one that goes to university and listens to podcasts. I ran. The road had a narrow concrete barrier along the channel side, an open field on the other side, separated from the road by a shallow drainage ditch and a wire fence. I hit the fence at full speed, caught my jacket on the wire, pulled free, and fell forward into the field beyond, landing hard on my hands and knees in the wet soil. I scrambled upright and ran parallel to the road into the darkness, putting distance between myself and the fence line before dropping down flat in the grass. The field was recently harvested beet, the soil heavy and uneven, and I pressed myself into a low furrow and lay there breathing through my mouth, trying to silence myself enough to hear what was happening on the road. The car had stopped. I could tell by the absence of engine sound and by the fact that no headlights had come on. I lay in the field in the dark, and I listened. For a while, there was nothing. The reeds along the channel moving in the wind. A train somewhere in the far distance. My own blood in my ears. I thought about my phone. It was in the front pocket of my jacket, and I could reach it without moving significantly. But the screen would light up, and if anyone was standing at the fence line looking into the field, they would see it immediately. I left it where it was. Then I heard the doors. 3 of them, I thought, 2 in close succession, and then a third a moment later, the sounds of people getting out of a car with no particular effort at quiet, which was somehow worse than if they'd been silent. Because silence would have suggested uncertainty. This had the quality of people who were not in a hurry, who were confident that the situation was developing in a direction that suited them. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I got up and ran. The field ahead of me was dark in every direction except for a faint gray shape about 300 or 400 meters out that I recognized as a line of willows marking a field boundary. Old trees, wide trunks, enough cover to disappear into if I reached them. I ran toward them through the uneven soil, not looking back, not thinking, just moving. My shoes were full of mud within 30 seconds. I ran. I reached the willows and pressed myself against the widest trunk and turned to look at the field behind me. In the darkness, I could make out the pale strip of the road and the dark shape of the car still sitting on it. There were no torches that I could see, no moving lights in the field between me and the fence. Either they had not come over or they were moving without light. I did not wait to establish which. I knew the field grid in this area from cycling through in the summers, and I oriented myself by the distant turbine lights and cut diagonally south through 2 more fields, staying well clear of any road, crossing 2 more wire fences and a shallow drainage ditch that soaked me to the knee, until I came out onto a farm track I recognized and followed it the remaining distance to Zwanenburg. I arrived at my parents' house at 1:30 in the morning, covered in mud from my jacket to my shoes, with both knees bleeding through my jeans and a scrape on my left forearm from the fence wire. I let myself in with my key and then stood in the hallway for a moment before going upstairs and waking my parents. My father called the police immediately. A report was taken the following morning in our kitchen, a young officer asking me to describe the car and the road location in detail, while my mother made coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. I described what I'd seen and heard as precisely as I could. The officer told me they would investigate and follow up. I stopped walking home that autumn. I began paying for taxis regardless of the cost, and told myself I was being sensible. The incident receded somewhat. It didn't go away, but it became something I could set aside on most days, something that lived in a particular compartment and stayed there. 6 weeks later, the police called. A group of men in their early 20s had been arrested following an assault on a retired schoolteacher named Mr. DeVries, 64 years old, who had been attacked on a dike road 3 villages over from Zwanenburg while walking his dog on a Thursday evening. The arresting officers had matched the vehicle to 2 earlier incidents, one of which was the report I had filed. The men were from a district of Rotterdam, and the investigating officer explained to my father, not to me initially as though the detail needed to be filtered before I received it, that the attacks appear to be deliberate excursions into rural areas specifically because rural roads in that region have no CCTV coverage. They targeted people walking alone at night. The assault on Mr. DeVries had sent him to hospital. I thought about the car's headlights going off, the deliberate one after the other quality of it, somebody reaching for the switch with intent. I thought about the 3 car doors opening. I finished my degree and moved to Amsterdam and have lived in cities ever since. I don't think that's entirely because of that night, but I don't think it's entirely unrelated either. I still walk at night sometimes. I don't use earphones anymore on roads without people. I stay aware of what's behind me in a way that has become habitual and that I have mostly stopped resenting as a loss of something because I think the thing I lost was never really mine to keep. It was just inexperience wearing the costume of confidence. Mr. DeVries, as far as I was later told, recovered. I have thought about him more times than I can count over the years. A 64-year-old man walking his dog on a road he had probably walked 500 times without incident, encountering the same set of headlights I encountered on a night when I happened to be younger and faster and drunk on tips and adrenaline in a way that made me run rather than freeze. Luck is uncomfortable to acknowledge because it implies a version of events where it went differently. But it was luck, entirely and simply luck. And whatever you think about walking alone at night, I would ask you not to do it with your ears covered because the only warning you are likely to get is a sound, and it will be brief, and the window between hearing it and needing to respond is not as wide as you would prefer it to be. I've worked the graveyard shift at a psychiatric rehabilitation center in rural Vermont for going on 11 years now. For those unfamiliar with how these places run, our facility has what we call the observation wing, a sealed corridor housing patients who require constant monitoring due to cognitive decline, severe anxiety disorders, or behavioral conditions that make unsupervised living a genuine risk. When you're on nights in the observation wing, the protocol is simple and slightly unnerving. The main door's locked behind you at 10 p.m., and it's just you a dim hallway, a laminate desk with a flickering monitor, and however many sleeping patients occupy the rooms on either side of that corridor. My colleagues avoid the night rotation up there whenever they can. It isn't the workload. Nights are quieter than days in almost every respect. It's the feeling, the sealed-in, cut-off, entirely on your own feeling that settles over you around midnight and doesn't lift until the morning crew buzzes in. I can radio the charge nurse on the floor below if something medical happens. Beyond that, I'm essentially alone. I've been doing this long enough to have lost any romantic ideas about what death and illness look like up close. Superstition was something I abandoned somewhere around my 3rd year on the job. But there have been a handful of nights in that wing that I've never quite been able to file away cleanly, and I've decided to write them down. It was sometime in the early hours, I guess between 2 and 3 in the morning, and the wing was so completely silent that the hum of the ventilation system felt almost loud by comparison. I was updating patient charts at my desk when something at the far end of the hallway caught my attention. Not a sound exactly, more like the impression that the silence had shifted. Then it came clearly from somewhere near the last room on the left. A voice, light and almost melodic, saying 3 words. I found you. I pushed back from my desk slowly. The hallway stretched empty in both directions. Every door was closed. I walked the full length of the corridor, checking each room, and every single patient was motionless and asleep. I stood in the middle of the hallway for a long moment, listening to nothing. Then, just as I turned to go back to my desk, it came again from the same end of the hall. "I found you." The same tilt in the voice, almost playful, like the punchline to a game. I'm not a person who frightens easily, but I will tell you honestly that I sat rigid at that desk until the morning shift arrived, and I did not get up once. When I described what I'd heard to my colleague Diane as she was taking over, she went very still. She asked me to repeat the exact words. When I did, she let out a slow breath and told me that a patient named Mr. Elias Voorhees, who had passed away on the ward 6 weeks earlier, used to play a hiding game with his great niece during visiting hours. The little girl would squeeze behind the curtain beside his bed, and when he pretended to search the room and finally discovered her, those were exactly the words he used, in exactly that tone. We eventually traced the voice to a patient in room 7 who had apparently absorbed the little ritual into some half-dreaming layer of memory and was reproducing it in her sleep. A perfectly sensible explanation. But for the 2 weeks it took us to work that out, not a single nurse on the night rotation was entirely comfortable walking to the end of that hallway. For a period of about 8 months, we had 2 women sharing the room at the end of the East Corridor. The first was a retired schoolteacher from New Hampshire named Rosalind, a gentle, deliberate woman who spent most of her waking hours doing crossword puzzles and occasionally watercolor paintings that she gave to the nursing staff. She had a quality that's genuinely rare in long-term care patients, which is a kind of uncomplaining dignity. Her joints gave her considerable pain, and she moved slowly, but she never asked for more than she was given and always thanked you for whatever you brought her. Her roommate was a different matter entirely. I won't use her name, but she was the sort of person who had apparently made a lifelong occupation of making everyone around her as miserable as possible. She was dismissive of the nurses, contemptuous of the other patients, and specifically and consistently cruel to Rosalind, whose quiet contentment seemed to infuriate her in ways she didn't bother concealing. Rosalind absorbed it with a patience that honestly made me feel ashamed of my own occasional impatience with difficult patients. She'd look up from her crossword, offer a thin, private smile, and return to whatever clue she'd been working on. Rosalind passed in October. She went in her sleep, which is the best any of us can hope for, and we were all genuinely sorry to lose her. What happened after is harder to explain straightforwardly. Rosalind's roommate, who had spent 8 months refusing to comply with nearly every nighttime request from nursing staff, who had to be practically negotiated into her bed each evening, who treated sleep as something happening to her against her will, suddenly would not stay in that room. Not at night. She wouldn't say why. When pressed, she became agitated in a way that was qualitatively different from her usual brand of hostility. This wasn't irritation. This was fear, and it was unmistakable. She began sleeping in the common room in a recliner, wrapped in a blanket with all the lights on, and none of the night staff pushed her to go back. One evening around midnight, one of our junior nurses found her standing in the hallway outside the room, both hands pressed flat against the closed door as though she was holding something inside. She was pale and breathing hard, and she hadn't used her walker, which she normally couldn't manage 3 steps without. When we got her settled and calm, she wouldn't say a word about what had happened. She never did. The staff didn't discuss it openly, the way you don't discuss certain things openly in a place like this. But we all shared the same quiet, unspoken thought about what she might have been seeing in that room at night, and who might have finally found a way to ensure she didn't sleep quite as soundly as she used to. This last one unsettled the staff more than either of the others, and I've thought about it more times than I can count. For a while, we were caring for an elderly Polish woman named Helena Brandt, a first-generation immigrant who had lived outside of Burlington for decades and spoke almost no English beyond the words needed to ask for water or indicate pain. She had the particular self-containment of someone who had survived genuinely hard things and didn't feel the need to perform distress for an audience. Most evenings, roughly an hour before she fell asleep, she would begin talking, not muttering, talking in a full and animated voice in Polish at a volume that carried easily into the hallway. I'd hear her from my desk, a steady stream of conversation, clearly directed at someone. When I'd go check on her, she would stop mid-sentence, arrange herself against her pillow, and close her eyes in a very unconvincing impression of someone who had been asleep for some time. The moment I returned to my desk, she'd resume. This became part of the nightly rhythm on the ward. We all knew Helena's bedtime conversation would run for 40 minutes or so before she genuinely drifted off, and we stopped worrying about it. Her daughter came to visit on a Thursday afternoon, and I'd been waiting for a chance to ask about the talking. The daughter posed a question in Polish. Helena's response was immediate and delivered in the tone of someone answering something obvious. The daughter turned to me with a mildly embarrassed expression and translated. She says she's talking to the gentleman who sits with her. When I asked for clarification, the daughter asked again. Helena gave a longer answer, gesturing toward the window side of her room with a kind of fond exasperation, as if describing someone I should be able to see for myself. Her friend, the daughter said. She says he visits in the evenings before she falls asleep. She says he's very good company. I should add that Helena's room housed no male patients, had not done so during her stay, and had only ever been entered at night by female nursing staff. Our senior nurse, a practical and plain-spoken woman named Carolyn who had worked in long-term care for over 30 years, had a theory. She believed that patients at this particular stage of life exist in a kind of perceptual territory the rest of us don't have access to. That proximity to death recalibrates something in the way the mind processes what's around it. I don't know whether I believe that. What I do know is that Helena was, by any measurable standard, the sharpest and most present person on the ward. Her memory was intact. Her reasoning was clear. She held conversations with her daughter that were detailed and coherent. She noticed things. She also talked, every single evening until the end of her stay, to something sitting by her window that none of the rest of us could see. I've worked in care long enough to know that the rational explanation usually turns out to be correct. I still look for it. But in a place where people live this close to the edge of whatever comes next, there are nights when the rational explanation feels less like a conclusion and more like a preference. Something you reach for not because it fits perfectly, but because the alternative is harder to carry home with you. This goes back about 15 years now. To a stretch of my life, I don't revisit particularly often. I was working the overnight shift at Marine Biology Research Institute on the Oregon coast, a position I'd stumbled into partly out of financial desperation and partly because the hiring coordinator had described it, with impressive dishonesty, as a quiet and independent work environment. Both of those things were technically true. What she hadn't mentioned was that quiet and independent, when applied to a building full of preserved biological specimens on a cliff above the Pacific Ocean at 2 in the morning, are not actually selling points. The Institute occupied a large converted cannery building that sat at the end of a service road about a quarter mile from the nearest public road. It was shaped something like a flattened L, with a longer arm housing the research labs and cold storage facilities, and a shorter arm containing the administrative offices, a small public exhibit space, and a reception area where I spent most of my shifts. The place was genuinely impressive during the day. Researchers, graduate students, the occasional school group coming to look at the display tanks. At night, it was a different place entirely. The tanks hummed. The building's old frame settled in the wind off the water, and I was the only person in it. My duties were light: monitor the facility phone line, do hourly checks on the temperature gauges for the cold storage units, update the specimen intake log, and generally keep the building from burning down. I brought food. I read. I watched movies on my laptop. It paid considerably better than anything else available to a 24-year-old with a biology degree in no particular direction, and for the first several months, I considered myself lucky to have found it. I still remember most nights from that period with a kind of blurred sameness. Dark parking lot, hum of the tanks, coffee, the smell of salt and formaldehyde that you stopped noticing after the first week. That's why the one night that was different from all the others has stayed with me in such complete detail. When everything around a single memory is uniform, The exception stands out with an almost photographic sharpness. It was a Thursday in late November, sometime after 3 in the morning, and I'd stepped outside to get some air and clear my head after falling half asleep over the intake log. The coast was doing what it does that time of year. Thick low cloud, no stars, the kind of cold that gets into your collar regardless of how you've dressed. I'd been outside maybe 5 minutes when I heard footsteps on the service road. Not the unhurried kind. Fast, irregular footsteps, the sound of someone who wasn't walking. A woman came into the light of the parking lot at something between a jog and a run. She was perhaps 50, wearing a quilted coat that looked like she'd grabbed it off a hook on the way out the door, and she was crying in the visible, uncontrolled way of someone who's been crying for a while and has stopped caring who sees it. She went straight to the front entrance, not noticing me standing off to the side, and began pressing the intercom buzzer in repeated short bursts. I told her I was right here and asked if she needed help. She turned and looked at me, and what struck me was that she didn't seem startled by my being outside at 3 in the morning. She was past the point where anything contextual was registering. She asked if she could come inside. Just that. Not what she needed, not what had happened. Just whether she could come in. I didn't have any good reason to say no. I let her in, sat her down in the reception area, found some paper towels from the bathroom since I didn't have tissues, and waited while she composed herself enough to speak. While I was expecting what people usually came to the Institute's door for at odd hours was some kind of marine emergency, a stranded animal, a boat with equipment concerns, a researcher who'd lost their keycard, something with a practical answer. What she told me instead took a moment to process. She had brought her pet in earlier that day, not a dog or a cat. A large Pacific octopus she'd kept in a home tank for nearly 7 years, which I was aware happened but had never personally encountered. The animal had died the previous evening, and she had brought it to the Institute because she knew the research staff accepted donations of deceased specimens for study and preservation. She had agreed to this, signed the paperwork, handed the animal over, and then she had driven home and spent the rest of the day and evening changing her mind. She wanted it back. Not for study, not for any practical reason. She wanted to bury it, she said, in the garden behind her house where her other animals were buried. She used the word precious without any apparent self-consciousness, and she was crying again by the time she said it. I explained as carefully as I could that I wasn't authorized to release any intake specimen without the approval of the receiving researcher, all of whose contact information was locked in the director's office. I told her she would need to come back during regular hours. I said all the things I was supposed to say. She listened to all of it and then looked at me with an expression that was less argumentative than simply exhausted and asked me to please just look. I want to be clear that what I did next was not procedure. It was not sanctioned. It was the decision of a 24-year-old who was alone in a building with a grieving woman at 3 in the morning and could not find a way to say no a second time. The specimen cold storage facility was in the basement of the building's longer arm, accessible through a key-coded door at the end of the main lab corridor. The room itself was a staging and processing area, stainless steel work tables, shelving units, labeling equipment, and at the far end of it sat the walk-in freezer where newly acquired specimens were held prior to processing or transfer to longer-term storage. The freezer was about the size of a large walk-in pantry, kept at a temperature that hit you like stepping into a different atmosphere. The lights inside were old fluorescent tubes that took several seconds to fully brighten, which meant your first few moments inside were spent in a yellowish half-dark that did nothing to improve the general experience. The smell was the thing. Even frozen, biological specimens produce a faint but distinct odor, something between cold copper and the low-tide smell of the rocks outside, compressed and concentrated. I had grown used to it, mostly. What I was not prepared for was opening the door and seeing how much material had come in over the previous week. The intake shelf, a long metal rack along the right wall, held a significant collection of sealed containers, labeled bags, and open trays, all frosted over and pressed against one another in the way that items in an overfull freezer inevitably are. I found the intake log entry for the octopus without much difficulty. Bay 7, sealed bag, received same day. Finding Bay 7 was also straightforward. What was waiting for me, there was not. The bag had been placed in the freezer before the contents had fully settled, and the octopus, which had been a large specimen, the woman had mentioned 7 years, and I was now understanding what that meant in practical terms, had partially extended out of the sealed closure and frozen to the contents of the adjacent tray, which contained a large preserved hagfish submitted by one of the graduate students earlier in the week. The two specimens had merged at the point of contact into a single frozen mass. I stood looking at this for what felt like a long time. I tried pulling the bag free with my hands, applying gradual pressure in different directions, but the bond was solid and I wasn't willing to risk tearing the bag. I found a thin metal spatula on the prep table outside the freezer and used it to work along the line of contact, applying leverage in small increments. The sound this produced was not one I want to describe in detail. I will say that it was loud enough to hear clearly over the hum of the freezer units, and that it bounced off the metal walls of the room in a way that seemed disproportionate to the scale of what I was doing. I got the bag free. The underside of it had lost some material where it had been in contact with the other specimen, and a portion of the hagfish's exterior had come away with it. I put the bag into an opaque black transport bag, sealed it, returned the hagfish tray to its shelf, and left the freezer. The woman was still sitting in the reception area when I came back. She stood up when she saw me carrying the bag and pressed both hands over her mouth. I gave her the bag. I did not tell her what the retrieval had involved. She thanked me in a way that was slightly more physical than I was comfortable with given the circumstances, and I watched her walk back out to the parking lot and get in her car and drive away up the service road. I washed my hands for a long time at the lab sink. I filled out an incident note for the morning staff and left it where the receiving researcher would find it, explaining that a specimen had been reclaimed by its original owner and offering to discuss. I went back to the reception desk and sat down and did not particularly feel like eating the rest of my sandwich. I still think about that night occasionally, and what I think about specifically is the moment in the parking lot when I heard her footsteps on the road and turned to look. The absolute certainty in her face that wherever she was going, whatever it took, she was going to bring something back with her. I understood it. I still do. Whether what she buried in her garden the following morning was entirely intact is a question I have made a consistent effort not to dwell on.